I sold my wedding jewelry to pay for my son's flight to America. My husband sold the only motorcycle he had. For years we gave up everything, festivals, new clothes, small comforts, so that he could have a better life on the other side of the world. And when he came back, 7 years later, he spent 3 weeks in India, visiting acquaintances, distant friends, people he barely kept in touch with, without knocking on my door, even once. But the brief, cold visit he eventually gave me was not the hardest part. What he told me at that dinner, casually, almost as an afterthought, as though it were a minor detail, was what truly broke something inside me. And when my husband fell seriously ill, I discovered exactly how much I was worth to the son I had raised. This is my story. My name is Anaya Sharma. I am 50 years old, and I live in a small town near Ludhiana, in the state of Punjab. If someone asked me today what it feels like to be a mother who gave everything for her son and was forgotten by him, I wouldn't know where to begin. Not because words fail me, but because the pain is too large to fit into simple sentences. It sits in the chest like a stone no one can see, but that you carry everywhere, in every step, every breath, every moment you smile to hide what lies beneath. When Rohan was small, he slept with his head on my lap every night. He was afraid of the dark. He would call out for me when he woke in the middle of the night, and I would run to him without even slipping on my chappals. My husband Rajiv would laugh and say I was raising a spoilt boy. I said I was raising a loved boy. I believed there was a great difference between the two. Today, I wonder whether I truly understood that difference, or whether I confused the two for far too long. Rajiv worked at a mechanic's workshop on the other side of town. He woke before sunrise and came home after dark. His hands always arrived full of grease and calluses, but his face always carried the same quiet smile of a man who had done what needed to be done. I stitched clothes for the neighbors, for relatives, for anyone who came to me. I sat at my old sewing machine sometimes past midnight, eyes burning but happy, because every stitch was one more rupee saved for our son's future. We lived without excess. Festivals came and went without new clothes, without expensive sweets, without grand celebrations. But we never complained. We never felt we were giving something up. We felt we were building something. Rohan grew up watching both of us work, or so I believed. He was intelligent, studious, and from an early age he spoke of wanting to go to America. I don't know where that wish came from. Perhaps from films, perhaps from stories his friends told, perhaps from something inside him that always wanted more than the space Punjab could offer. I never questioned that dream. A mother does not question her son's dream. A mother helps build the path. When he was 22, the opportunity arrived. A job at a technology company in the United States through a work visa sponsored by an acquaintance already living there. It was a scramble of documents, medical tests, translations, papers signed and redone and signed again. Rajiv sold the motorcycle. I sold the few pieces of jewelry I had kept since our wedding. We borrowed from close relatives without feeling ashamed because we knew it was for a worthy cause. The day the visa was approved, Rohan cried. I cried too. Rajiv said nothing, but his eyes shone in a way I had rarely seen in him. At the airport, when the time came for him to pass through the departure gate, he held me for a long time. I breathed in the smell of his hair, the same smell as always, and thought that this embrace needed to last long enough to sustain me for some time. He said, I'll call as soon as I land, and take care of yourself and Papa. He said all the right things. I believed every word. In the first few months, he truly called almost every day. He told us about the small flat he shared with other Indians, about the cold he had never felt before, about the enormous supermarkets where everything was different, about the wide roads, about the lights that stayed on through the night. I listened with my eyes closed, trying to picture every detail. I would hold the phone up so Rajiv could hear from across the room, and he would listen with that quiet, proud smile of his. But the months passed. The calls grew shorter, then more infrequent. They became messages, and the messages shrank too, until they were one-word replies that felt like favors he was doing me. I would write long texts about the neighborhood, about Rajiv's health, about the Lori festival, about the neighbor's daughter who had married, about the old mango tree in the backyard that had finally borne fruit after years, and he would reply, nice, or, okay, or simply not reply at all. I told myself he was busy, that life in America was fast, different, demanding, that he was building something there and needed to focus. A mother invents beautiful stories so she does not have to face the ugly ones. I did this for years. I kept telling myself those beautiful stories until the day he came back to India, and I could no longer pretend I wasn't seeing what was right in front of me. When I heard he had arrived, I felt a joy I hadn't felt in a long time. I cleaned the house from top to bottom. I made the dishes he had loved as a child. I set out the softest bed linen, and I waited. On the first day, I waited. On the second as well. On the third, I started calling. He answered quickly, always with that hurried voice, saying he was with friends, that he'd come soon, not to worry, not to worry, as though worry were something a mother could simply choose to feel or not feel. 3 weeks, he was in India. 3 weeks during which I learned, from the neighbors, from relatives, from the entire town, that my son was visiting everyone but me. There is a specific pain that only a mother knows. It is not the pain of a fall, nor of an illness, nor of a loss the world can see and acknowledge. It is a pain with no easy name that does not show on your face, that you learn to hide behind a practiced smile, because you know that if you let it show, you'll have to explain it, and explaining hurts even more. It is the pain of being ignored by the son you brought into the world with your own body, whom you fed with your own hands, whom you loved before you ever met him. I learned to live with that pain during those 3 weeks. Mrs. Kaur, who lived 2 houses up the lane, was the first to ask. I was at the corner shop buying milk when she appeared with that smile people wear when they want to know about a delicate matter without seeming to pry. Anaya, has your son come to see you yet? I heard he's been in town for days. I smiled. I said he was busy, that he'd be over soon, that life for someone settled abroad is complicated even when they're visiting. She nodded in that way people do when they don't believe you but pretend they do to spare your feelings. I took my milk and went home before she could ask anything more. At home, Rajiv was sitting on the veranda reading the newspaper. He didn't ask about Rohan, but I knew he was waiting too, because every now and then he would look down the street with an attention that wasn't the ordinary attention of someone watching the day go by. It was the attention of someone waiting for a person to appear. I poured his tea without a word. I sat beside him. We were quiet together for a while, and in that silence there were things neither of us wanted to put into words. Rajiv had aged more than I'd expected over those years. The calloused hands had grown slower, his back bent from years of leaning over engines, and a cough that had appeared 2 winters ago and never quite left. He never complained. He was never one for complaints. But I knew him well enough to know when something weighed on him, and our son weighed on him, weighed heavily. On the 5th day after Rohan arrived in town, I received a message from him saying he was well, that he was enjoying the time with childhood friends, that he'd come by soon. I replied carefully, without pressing, without letting it show how much those words were hurting me. I wrote that I was waiting with food ready, that I had made the dal makhani he loved, that the house was tidy. He replied with a single heart emoji, a small heart on a phone screen, as though that were enough to replace everything I needed. The neighbors kept asking. Each question was a small needle in the same place. I began avoiding the street during the hours when I knew they usually stood in front of their houses. I went out early, came back quickly, stayed indoors more than usual. Rajiv noticed, but said nothing. One evening, he placed his hand over mine while we sat watching television, without really watching anything, and pressed it gently. He didn't need to say what he was feeling. I already knew. In the 2nd week, I heard from my brother-in-law's niece that Rohan had gone to the Mehta house, a family we barely knew, to visit their son who had come back from the Gulf. They had dinner together, talked until late, taken photographs. The photos appeared on social media. Someone showed them to me without realizing what they were doing, and I looked at the screen with a smile fixed on my face while inside. Something broke with great care and no sound at all, like a dry branch that slowly gives way before it snaps. It was that same night that I called him, not to reproach him. I called because I needed to hear my son's voice, needed to convince myself that the boy I knew still existed somewhere inside the man I could no longer recognize. He answered after many rings, with the voice of someone who had been interrupted in the middle of something important. I asked how he was. He said, "Fine, Ma, I already told you." I asked when he was coming by. He said, "Soon." I asked if he was eating properly. He gave a short, slightly impatient laugh and said, "Ma, I live in the States. I know how to take care of myself," as though taking care of himself were the same as not needing me anymore. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. When it ended, I sat staring at the phone for a moment I couldn't measure. Then I went to the kitchen, covered the dal makhani that had been waiting another day, turned off the flame under the rice, and sat down on the floor near the sink because my legs wouldn't carry me to the chair. I didn't cry. I sat on the cold kitchen floor in silence, thinking about the years I'd spent bent over the sewing machine, about the jewelry I'd sold, about the nights I'd gone to sleep a little hungry so the month's accounts would balance, about every sacrifice I had made with a full heart because I believed I was building something real. And I asked myself out loud for the first time, even if only to myself, whether I had actually built anything, or whether I had simply helped my son leave. He appeared on the 17th morning. I was in the kitchen when I heard the knock at the door. A short, distracted knock, the kind made by someone not quite sure they want to come in. I wiped my hands on the kitchen towel and walked to the front door with my heart beating in a way that embarrassed me because I realized I was nervous to open the door for my own son, nervous as though it were an important visitor, as though it were a stranger. When I opened it, there he was, taller than I remembered, or perhaps it was just the posture, that way of standing with his shoulders back that he hadn't had before. He wore clothes I didn't recognize, simple but of a different kind from what people wore here. He had cut his hair in a new style. He held his phone in his hand, as always, and looked at me with a smile that was correct but didn't reach his eyes. He said, "Hi, Ma." Just that, "Hi, Ma," as though he had stepped out the evening before to pick up something from the corner shop and was only now coming back. I opened the door wider and told him to come in. He came in, looking around with an expression I couldn't quite name at the time, but that I came to understand later. It was the expression of someone seeing a place that is smaller than they remembered. The room I had cleaned 3 times that week, the cushions I had rearranged, the photograph of him as a child that I had reframed because the old frame was peeling. All of it he took in with that measuring gaze that compared and diminished without saying a single word. Rajiv was on the veranda and came in when he heard his son's voice. The two greeted each other with a quick embrace, one of those brief embraces between men that last a second and say little. Rajiv had his usual quiet smile, but I saw that his eyes were wet. He blinked quickly and went to sit on the sofa. Rohan sat on the other side, phone still in hand. I went to fetch tea and the biscuits I had bought especially, kept in a tin since the first week, waiting for this moment. When I returned, the two of them were sitting in silence. Rajiv was trying to start a conversation, and Rohan was responding with short, polite answers of the kind that lead nowhere. I said I had cooked, that I could heat everything in 5 minutes, that there was dal makhani, rice, the bread he liked. He said he had already eaten, that he wasn't hungry. Thank you. I sat and tried to make conversation. I asked about work. He said it was going well, that the company had grown, that he had received a promotion the previous year. I congratulated him with a heart genuinely full of pride, because even through everything, even through all the pain of those past weeks, he was still my son, and his achievement was still mine too. He nodded the way you nod when a colleague congratulates you, not a mother. Then he began talking about America, not because anyone had asked, but because it seemed to be the only subject that truly animated him. He talked about the streets, the organization, the cleanliness, about how things worked there, about how the healthcare system was different, about how people were punctual and respectful and professional. He talked about the house he was thinking of buying, 2 bedrooms, a garage, a quiet neighborhood. He described all of this looking at the space in front of him, as though he were telling a dream to himself, not having a conversation with his parents. And then he began to find fault with here, not all at once, not brutally, but gradually, in comments he probably didn't even notice were slipping out. He said the Punjab heat was unbearable, that he had forgotten how difficult it was. He said the roads had got worse. He looked out of the window and remarked that the town hadn't changed at all, with a tone that made that lack of change sound like a flaw, evidence of backwardness. He looked at the television we had and said, almost without thinking, that back in the States he had an enormous screen in the living room, a completely different experience. Rajiv said nothing through all of this, nor did I. But inside, I felt something strange happening, a mixture of sadness and something close to anger, though I didn't want to call it anger because a mother does not feel anger towards her son, or at least that was what I had always believed. But I was feeling something that hurt in a different way from longing. It was the pain of realizing that the place where I had lived, where I had worked all my life, where I had raised my son, where I had grown old beside my husband, was being described as an inferior place by the man sitting on my sofa with a phone in his hand. Less than an hour later, he stood up. He said he had plans with some friends, that he'd come by again before he flew out, that we'd talk. He hugged Rajiv again, gave me a quick kiss on my forehead, and left. The door closed with a soft click. Rajiv stared at the door for a moment. Then he looked at me, and he said, in that low, tired voice he only used when he was deeply hurt, "He left again, Anaya. Except this time, he left without leaving India." I didn't know what to say, because that was exactly it. My son had come back in body, but had left something essential on the other side of the ocean. Or perhaps he had left it here, before he ever departed, and I simply hadn't noticed at the time. What I didn't yet know was that the brief, cold visit was only the beginning, that the greater pain was still coming, wrapped in news he saved for the very last day, mentioned almost in passing, like something of no importance. He came back one last time 2 days before flying back to the United States. The visit lasted a little over 2 hours, and for most of it, he stayed in the room that had once been his, on his phone, making video calls with people I didn't know, laughing at jokes in English I couldn't follow. I stayed in the kitchen preparing dinner, listening to that laughter drifting from his room and feeling an unease I couldn't quite name. It was like having a guest in the house, a polite guest who caused no trouble, but who did not truly belong to that space. The three of us had dinner together. It was the only meal we shared during his entire trip. I had made more than necessary, as though food could fill what words were failing to fill. Rohan ate without comment. Rajiv tried to tell a story about a funny customer who had come into the workshop, and Rohan gave a short, polite laugh, the kind that shows you are listening but are not really there. It was after dinner, when the plates had been cleared and I was pouring the tea, that he said it. He said it casually, looking at his cup, the way you mention something that has already been discussed many times and no longer needs ceremony. He said he was seeing an American woman, that her name was Ashley, that they had been together for nearly 2 years, and that he was thinking of marrying her the following year. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences of that visit. This one had weight. It had texture. I felt Rajiv stiffen beside me without moving a centimeter. Do not misunderstand me. I was never the kind of mother who believes a son belongs only to his own community, that love has borders, or that marriage must follow a script written by someone else. I had seen arranged marriages make people unhappy for decades. I never wanted that for my son. What broke me was not her name, not where she came from, not the different religion or culture. What broke me was the 2 years. 2 years. He had been with this woman for 2 years, and I had never heard her name. Never. Not in any call, not in any message, not at any moment had he said, "Ma, there is someone in my life." Nothing. I had found out from neighbors that my son was visiting distant acquaintances, and now I was finding out, in passing after dinner, with the tea still warm in the cup, that he was nearly married to someone I didn't even know existed. Rajiv asked in that controlled voice of his, "Why didn't you tell us before?" Rohan shrugged slightly and said he hadn't wanted to complicate things, that he knew we'd have questions, that he had been waiting until he was sure. Sure. 2 years, to be sure. I wondered in silence how many other things he was waiting to be sure about before telling me. I asked the questions a mother asks. I asked what she was like, what she did, whether she was a good person, whether he was happy. He answered everything briefly, with sentences that gave information, but not intimacy. It was like reading a form about my son's life. All the details were there, but the person was not. Then he said something that stayed with me long after he left. He mentioned that Ashley came from a very close family, that her parents spoke to her every week, had dinner together when they could, that theirs was a very open relationship. He said it as a compliment to her family, and I heard it as a veiled accusation against mine. as though the breakdown in communication between us were my responsibility, as though I hadn't tried, as though I hadn't written long messages that he answered with one word, as though I hadn't called until he picked up with the voice of someone who had been interrupted. Rajiv was quiet for the rest of the evening. When Rohan went to sleep, my husband sat alone on the veranda for a long time. I went out and sat beside him. The night was warm and still, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked now and then. Rajiv said, without looking at me, he's going to marry her, raise children with her, and her family will be present for all of it. And we will hear about things afterwards, the way we heard about it today. It was not an accusation, it was a statement of fact. And a statement of fact sometimes hurts more than an accusation, because it leaves no room to argue. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay looking at the ceiling, thinking about all the versions of the future I had imagined for my son. In none of them was I an afterthought. In none of them did I find out about things in passing, after dinner, like someone receiving a notification. In every version I had ever dreamed, I was part of his life, not at the center. A grown son doesn't need his mother at the center, but part of it, a real part, present, consulted, considered. The following morning, as he prepared to leave for good, I held him at the door longer than he seemed comfortable with. I felt his body tense slightly, waiting for me to let go. I let go. He walked down the lane with his suitcase, and I watched until he turned the corner and disappeared. Rajiv placed his hand on my shoulder. He said nothing. We went inside together. I didn't yet know that that morning, already so difficult, would be the last time we saw our son for far longer than I could have imagined, and that the reason he would take so long to return would not be work, or the distance, or the busyness of life in America. Rajiv fell ill 4 months later. The cough he had carried for 2 winters suddenly worsened within a matter of weeks, in a way that alarmed even him, a man who had never complained about anything in his life. I took him to the local doctor, who ordered tests, which led to more tests, which led to a consultation in Ludhiana with a specialist who had a small clinic near the big hospital. The specialist looked at the results with that expression doctors wear when they are choosing their words before saying something that will change someone's life. Lung condition. Serious. He would need prolonged treatment, expensive medicines, regular monitoring. It was not the end, the doctor made a point of saying, but it was grave enough to require immediate attention and constant care. On the drive home, Rajiv was silent the whole way. I drove, watching the road, feeling the weight of a silence different from all others. When we arrived, he sat on the veranda, looked at the street for a while, then turned to me and said, "Don't tell Rohan just yet. He has his own life." I looked at my husband, that man who had worked without complaint his entire life, who had sold his motorcycle without hesitation to help his son reach a dream, who had sat in silence on the veranda that night after dinner, absorbing a pain he had never asked for. And I felt a mixture of love and sorrow so vast, it could not fit entirely in my chest. I said I would tell him, that Rohan needed to know. I called that same evening. He answered after a few rings, that familiar voice, a little hurried as always. I told him about the diagnosis, the tests, what the doctor had said. There was a pause on the other end. Then he asked whether it was serious. I said yes, it was, that his father would need treatment. Another pause. Then he said he would look into it, that he'd see what he could do, that he'd call back soon. He waited 3 days to call back. When he did, he said he had spoken to Ashley, that the two of them had thought it through together, and that unfortunately it wasn't possible to come right now because he had just been assigned an important project at work, and taking leave at this point would jeopardize his position at the company. He said he would send money to help with the medicines. He said he was worried, that he hoped for his father's recovery, that we should keep in touch. He said all of this in an organized, measured tone, like someone presenting a reasonable solution to a logistical problem. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "That's all right, son." And I hung up. I don't know why I said that's all right. It was not all right. Nothing was all right. But the words came before I could think. Perhaps because a part of me was still protecting that image I had kept of him. The boy who slept with his head on my lap, who called out for me in the night, who cried at the airport when he left. I did not want to accept that that boy had become a man who sent money in place of presents when his father was ill. The months that followed were the hardest of my life. I took Rajiv to his appointments twice a week, managed his medicines, looked after his diet, looked after the house, and still tried to stitch when I had the energy to sit at the machine, because the expenses had increased and Rajiv's pension did not cover everything. I lost weight without noticing. I slept badly. I woke too early and sat in the kitchen in the dark, waiting for the day to come, drinking tea that went cold before I finished it, because my mind was always somewhere else. Rohan sent money every month. That is true, and I used that money with gratitude because I needed it. But money does not sit beside a person at 3 a.m. when she cannot sleep for worry. Money does not hold Rajiv's hand when he coughs until his eyes fill with water. Money does not fill the silence of a house where two old people grow old together, waiting for a son who lives on the other side of the world and who has chosen, quite deliberately, to remain there. The neighbors knew. The town knew. In small towns, things do not stay hidden for long, and what is worse than suffering is suffering while everyone around you watches, comments, and laments with that mixture of pity and curiosity that sometimes hurts more than the thing itself. I began declining invitations, to visits, to festivals, to anything that would put me in a room where I'd have to answer questions about my son or endure looks that said what people were too well bred to say out loud. There was an older woman, Dadi Preet, who lived nearby and would sometimes appear unannounced, with a pot of food or a handful of herbs she said were good for a cough. She never asked about Rohan, never commented. She would sit, drink tea, talk about other things, and leave. She was the only visitor I looked forward to without dread. Once, as she was leaving, she paused at the door and said, almost to the air, without looking at me, "A son whom a mother raises through sacrifice and who then forgets the way home is not the mother's fault. It is the mother's sorrow. They are different things." Then she left. I stood at the threshold for a long time, turning those words over, fault and sorrow. I had spent months confusing the two, carrying them as though they were the same thing, as though my son's absence were somehow proof that I had failed. Dadi Preet, with the simple wisdom of someone who has lived much and lost much and still makes tea for others, had separated the two things with a single sentence. But even understanding that with my mind, my heart had not yet learned the difference. And it was about to be tested in a way I was not prepared for. Rajiv recovered, not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, with the silent stubbornness that marked everything he did in life. The medicines worked their way through months. The cough gradually eased, and one winter morning, nearly a year after the diagnosis, he drank his tea on the veranda without coughing once, and looked at me with that quiet smile of his, as though this were a victory the two of us had won together. And it was. It truly was. Rohan called when he heard his father was better. It was a longer call than usual, nearly 20 minutes, and he seemed genuinely relieved. He asked about the most recent tests, about the doctor, about the next steps in the treatment. I answered everything carefully, without irony, without pressing him on what had not been given during the difficult months. It was not the moment for that. Perhaps it never would be. At the end of the call, he mentioned that the wedding to Ashley was set for the following month. A small ceremony, he said, just close friends and her family. He said it didn't make sense for us to travel so far for something simple, that they would have a celebration here in India when they next visited. When they next visited. Those words that live in the future and never reach the present. I hung up and stood still in the middle of the room for a moment. My son was getting married, and I would not be there. Not because I hadn't been invited, but because he had built a version of his own life in which my presence was a detail that could be postponed, rearranged, replaced by a future celebration that might never come. I thought of Ashley's mother, who was probably at that moment helping her daughter choose a dress, who would sit in the front row at the ceremony, who would cry with emotion, while I would be here in Punjab, learning of my only son's wedding through a phone screen. I went to the bedroom, opened the dresser drawer, and took out an old photograph. Rohan, at perhaps 6 or 7 years old, sitting on my lap, both of us smiling at whoever was holding the camera. I was wearing a mustard-colored dupatta that I can no longer remember what became of. He was holding a piece of roti in his hand and looked deeply satisfied with this fact. He was such a simple child to make happy. Bread, his mother's lap, and the world was in order. I put the photograph away and went to make dinner. I don't know exactly when I made the decision. It was not a dramatic moment. Not a sudden revelation. There were no tears or speeches. It was something that grew inside me with the slowness of things that are true, over weeks, until one day I realized I had already decided without being able to pinpoint the exact moment it had happened. I stopped waiting. I did not stop loving my son. That is not something one decides, that you switch on and off like a tap. I continued loving him with the same intensity as always, perhaps even more, because love that survives repeated disappointment has a hardness that easy love does not know. But I stopped organizing my life around a presence that was not coming. I stopped cooking dishes that sat and waited. I stopped checking my phone for messages that weren't arriving. I stopped feeling ashamed in front of the neighbors, as though my son's choices were a failing of mine that I needed to conceal. I returned to stitching with more purpose. I took new orders, began teaching 2 young girls from the neighborhood who wanted to learn. Dadi Preet began coming more often, and our conversations grew longer, more honest, more good. Rajiv grew stronger and returned to doing small repair jobs at the workshop, not full-time, but enough to have something to do, which for him was nearly the same thing as health. Life settled back into a rhythm that was ours, not the rhythm I had imagined. With a son nearby, perhaps grandchildren one day, that old age surrounded by family that every mother in Punjab pictures when she closes her eyes and thinks of the future. But a real rhythm, a present one, that truly existed, that did not depend on anyone living on the other side of an ocean in order to be lived. Rohan sent photographs of the wedding by message. Ashley wore a white dress and smiled at the camera with an open, genuine smile. He was in a suit, his hair neatly done, and he looked happy in a way I recognized, because it was the same way he had looked happy as a child, with his eyes narrowing slightly and his smile tilting a little to the right. I replied with a message saying she was beautiful and that I wished them both happiness, and I meant it. I meant every word of it. But when I closed the phone and looked out of the window at the street, I knew by heart, at the neighbors' houses, at the mango tree at the back of the yard that bore fruit every year with a faithfulness that moved me. I realized I had made peace with something, not with the absence, because the absence still hurt, not with the silence, because the silence still weighed, but with the idea that I had not failed. I raised my son with everything I had. I gave him more than I was able to give. I gave up things I didn't even know I would miss so that his path would be clear. And he went, and he became someone who chose to build his life far from me in ways I did not expect and do not entirely understand even now. That belongs to him. That choice is his, with everything it carries. What is mine is what remains. The husband on the veranda drinking his tea without coughing. The girls learning to sew at my old machine. Dadi Preet coming by with herbs and staying for conversation. The mango tree. The photograph in the dresser drawer. The memory of a 6-year-old boy holding a piece of bread on my lap. Completely happy with that. No one can take those things from me. Not the distance, not the silence. Not the years that passed in a way different from what I had dreamed. I am Anaya Sharma. I am 50 years old. I was a good mother. And I learned, later than I would have wished, but still in time, that that is enough.